On June 22nd, 1967, music critic Tom Phillips of The Village Voice would write the following review of the Beatles' latest LP, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A lot of people seem to have misunderstood the new Beatles album. Richard Goldstein, reviewing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in last Sunday's Times, calls it an album of special effects, dazzling, but ultimately fraudulent. He only likes the last song, A Day in the Life, a coda to an otherwise undistinguished collection of work. Without attempting a point-by-point refutation of Goldstein, I must say that I think the Beatles have scored a genuine breakthrough with Sgt. Pepper. Specifically, I think they've turned the record album itself into an art form. What you have here is not a weird coda to a series of unrelated songs, but a comment on a world created by those songs. The internal relationships may not be blatant, but they are real. And one way you can tell this is by noticing the strong sense of having been through something when you finish listening to all of Sgt. Pepper. My verdict, the most ambitious and most successful record album ever issued. The most significant artistic event of 1967. Welcome to part 4 of the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. While I try to write these videos so each stands alone, if you would like to begin with part 1, you can find it in the top right corner or in the description below.
I did a freak-out one then, one of them where you don't know what you're doing.
Lovely Rita is just another example of one of Paul's most superb gifts, writing characters. What this talent really comes down to is observation. He can spot a person on the street and in his head create a whole story about them. Nobody liked parking attendants or meter maids, so to write a song about being in love with a meter maid, someone nobody else liked, was amusing in itself. There was one particular meter maid in Portland Place on whom I based Rita. She was slightly military looking. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but those meter maids were never good looking. You never heard anybody say, "God, that's one stunning parking attendant." In any case, I caught a glimpse of Rita opposite the Chinese embassy in Portland Place. She was filling in a ticket in her little white book, the cap, the bag across her shoulder. It's sheer observation. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The secret to successful songwriting is the ability to paint a picture. And a real meter maid, one named Meta Davies, would later claim that she had inspired Paul to write the song, recalling in the paper, "His car was parked on a meter where the time had expired. I just put it on the windscreen when Paul came along and took it off. He looked at it and read my signature, which was in full. As he was walking away, he turned to me and said, 'Oh, is your name really Meta?' I told him that it was. 'That would be a good name for a song. Would you mind if I use it?' And that was that. Off he went." But Paul denies this story. As often happened, it was claimed by a girl called Rita, who was a traffic warden, who apparently did give me a ticket. I think it was more a question of coincidence. Anyone called Rita who gave me a ticket would naturally think, "It's me." I didn't think, "Wow, that woman gave me a ticket. I'll write a song about her." Never happened like that. It was a long day in the studio, but mostly just for Paul and the engineers. The Beatles banged out 8 takes of the basic rhythm track in good time, with Paul taking up the piano for the recordings. Paul then stayed behind while the rest of the band departed, taking his time to overdub his bass line, working with the already recorded rhythm track, which, as deftly put by engineer Jeff Emmerich, enabled him to hear the song as a whole, and therefore create melodic bass lines that perfectly complemented the final arrangement. He would do those overdubs in the wee hours, long after everyone else had gone home. The next day, Paul would pop in to record his lead vocal for the track.
Took her out and tried to win her. Had a laugh and over dinner. Told her I would really like to see her again.
On February 27th, the Daily Mail ran the following article. The father of 17-year-old Melanie Coe, the schoolgirl who seemed to have everything, spent yesterday searching for her in London and Brighton. Melanie had her own car. It was left, unlocked, outside her home when she vanished. She had a wardrobe full of clothes. She took only those she was wearing. She left her checkbook and drew no money from her account. She has been missing from her home for a week. Her father, businessman Mr. John Coe, said yesterday, "I cannot imagine why she would run away. She has everything here. We have spoken to her friends and visited places where she goes, but there is no trace of her. I only wish she would telephone us."
Right, now, concentrate, swinging. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green.
John has always vehemently denied that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds has anything to do with LSD. But John, far more than Paul or George, has always been a bit more coy when it comes to his lyrics. Another example off the top of my head is his denial that Happiness is a Warm Gun makes any reference to heroin.
And it also was about a gun, not about heroin or anything. And those days I had no idea about heroin. I'd never seen it, nor knew anybody that had ever touched it or taken it.
Which really is dubious to me.
I need a fix 'cause I'm going down.
There is no doubt, however, that the seed of inspiration was planted by a drawing that his son Julian brought home one day.
Well, we don't have much time left. Does anyone have any idea how much time we do have? Let me confirm quickly a couple rumors with you.
Yes.
One of them, has it ever been settled whether Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was a code for anything?
This is the truth. My son came home with a drawing and showed me this strange-looking woman flying around. I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." And I thought, that's beautiful. I immediately wrote a song about it. The song had gone out, the whole album had been published, and somebody noticed that the letters spelt out LSD, and I had no idea about it.
And Lucy, turns out, was a real girl, Lucy O'Donnell, who attended the Weybridge private nursery school with Julian. Paul recalls the day the song was written.
I said, we sat down. I contributed half of the song. I remember clearly arriving at John's place, it's in the book here, where he had this little drawing that Julian, his son, had done. And across the top of it, in this very naive children's writing, was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. John said, "What about that for a title, huh?" I said, "Fantastic." He said, "Well, come on, let's go upstairs and write it," which we did.
Just like that.
I remember coming up with cellophane flowers and newspaper taxis, and John answered with things like kaleidoscope eyes and looking glass ties. We never noticed the LSD initial until it was pointed out later, by which point people didn't believe us. When they came into the studio today, they were once more accompanied by a photographer and journalist from Life magazine. This journalist would be the one to ask Paul if he had ever taken LSD, to which Paul replied honestly, yes. But these were not the days of social media and instant news, so the story wouldn't break until the article was released months later. Like so many of John's songs, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds took a fair amount of rehearsing and rearranging to reach a recordable state. This pattern was something Jeff Emmerich would remark on. By now, it was evident that John's personality was changing. Instead of being opinionated about everything, he was becoming complacent. In fact, he seemed quite content to have someone else do his thinking for him, even when we were working on one of his songs. And a quick note here, there has been some discussion about Emmerich's recollections and his perceived bias for Paul. While it is important to take this into account, myself and every single person watching this video also has biases toward one person or another. The fact of the matter is, Emmerich's thoughts are invaluable, biased or not, as beyond George Martin, there was no one else as closely involved with the Beatles' creative process during their career. EMI engineer Peter Vince would say, although they'd used the studio as a rehearsal room, you couldn't just clear off because they might be trying something out. What people don't realize is the boredom factor. Sgt. Pepper's took 4 months to record, and for probably more than half that time, all the engineers were doing was sitting around, waiting for them to get their ideas together. And this would also be touched on in the eventual Life article. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies, sings John over and over again. I begin to understand the remarkable process of the Beatles' music. It begins absolutely from scratch. It is now almost midnight in the recording studio, and after 4 hours of assault, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds still sounds quite terrible. Fifth Beatle Martin grimaces. We are light years from anything tonight, he shudders. They know it is awful now, and they're trying to straighten it out. It may be a week before they're pleased. If ever. They're always coming up with something new they've just learned, something I wouldn't dream of. They never cease to amaze me. I can't help but think George Martin said that last bit with a note of sarcasm in his voice.
Newspaper taxis appear on the shore, waiting to...
Despite the troubles of the day before, the Beatles actually began recording Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. They spent 7 takes on the rhythm track, with only a guide vocal from John. At the end of the day, John's guide vocal was wiped, and was replaced by a tambora drone, an idea from George Harrison.
Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly. A girl with...
I've been hard on George throughout these Pepper videos. While there is no doubt his contributions so far had been far and in between, the dreamy and esoteric nature of Lucy in the Sky lended itself wonderfully toward George's continually budding passion for Indian composition and sounds. During vocals in Indian music, they have an instrument called a sarangi, which sounds like a human voice. And the vocalist and sarangi player are more and less in unison in a performance. For Lucy, I thought of trying that idea, but because I'm not a sarangi player, I played it on the guitar. In the middle 8 of the song, you can hear the guitar playing along with John's voice.
Cellophane flowers of yellow and green.
Up next was the lead vocal, and John, most likely in Space Cadet mode, had an idea that was far more ridiculous than it was creative. He wanted to be hung up by a rope and spun around the microphone while he sang, to lend his vocal a psychedelic quality. Emmerich recalls, Mal was duly dispatched to see if he could find a rope so John could try out his theory. From the wink Mal gave me when he returned some hours later, empty-handed, I suspect that he had spent the evening in the pub instead. He knew how absurd and potentially dangerous the request was, and he probably guessed that John would have forgotten all about it by the time he got back, which of course is exactly what happened. His lead vocal, as well as Paul's harmonies, were recorded at 45 cycles per second, rather than the regular 50, so that when played at the normal speed, were a much higher pitch, giving their vocals that close to Mickey Mouse sound. Today, the Beatles returned to the title track, Sgt. Pepper's, after having last done recording work a month prior. It was time for the brass overdubs. One of the brass players, John Burden, would recall, they didn't really know what they wanted. I wrote out phrases for them based on what Paul McCartney was humming to us and George Martin. All 4 Beatles were there, but only Paul took an active interest in our overdub. Already the Beatles, primarily Paul, were working to create a real-life visualization of their alter Pepper egos. The Beatles' early days were defined by their English Chesterfield suits that they wore at the behest of Brian Epstein. And so, of course, the Peppers needed their own, equally defined image. The aesthetic they came up with was one that had already been percolating in the culture. At the time, everyone was into that I was Lord Kitchener's valet thing. Kids in bands wearing soldiers' outfits and putting flowers in the barrels of rifles. What? You don't know what I was Lord Kitchener's valet is? Time for a quick history lesson. What it was a clothing boutique. One that quickly gained popularity with the swinging London scene. Jimi Hendrix's iconic military coat, it was purchased from the boutique. In fact, this antique military aesthetic was the shop's bread and butter. And if you were an artist or musician hanging around London at the time, then you most likely bought a thing or two there. And remember a couple videos ago when I ridiculed Paul for wearing a Confederate general's costume? There's a very good chance that he purchased it at this very store. But the Sgt. Pepper uniforms were not purchased here. They were custom made by Bermans, who specialized in theatrical costumes. And during today's recording session, a representative from Bermans came by with fabric samples for the boys to look over, as they each wanted their own unique textures and colors. During all of this, George Harrison had been working meticulously for hours, hammering down the song's guitar solo, only for Paul to swoop in near the end of the session and record his own guitar solo, which was the one they ended up using. There was just one last piece to complete the title track, the sound effects. The boys wanted to give the song the impression of a live performance, of the Peppers introducing themselves before a crowd. Some of the sounds used were actually from the orchestral overdubs for A Day in the Life. But the rest were pulled from the EMI Sound Archive. These were Volume 28, Audience Applause and Atmosphere, and Volume 6, Applause and Laughter, the latter which was actually recorded by George Martin himself in 1961. We had an audience laughing on the front of Sgt. Pepper. It had always been one of my favorite moments. I'd listened to the radio a lot as a kid, and there had always been a moment in a radio show, say with somebody like Tommy Cooper, where he would walk on stage and he'd say hello, and they'd laugh, and my imagination went wild whenever that happened. I thought, what is it? Has he dropped his trousers?
Thank you very much. Oh, dear. I wear my tails tonight. Do you like them?
It fascinated me so much. So when we did Pepper, there's one of those laughs for nothing in there. Before the Beatles came into the studio at 7 p.m., Paul continued to work on the visual side of Pepper. And it was around this time that he began to conceptualize the grand, revolutionary sleeve. Quick pause in the timeline here, because we have some catching up to do. On February 10th, the Beatles recorded the orchestral overdubs for A Day in the Life, a day of recording that was as much a party as anything. Included in the large group of guests was the design collective, The Fool. It's time I give a short backstory here, because I have mentioned the Fool Design Collective many times, and they were one of the most important figures in the development of what we now recognize as the psychedelic aesthetic. The original members of the collective were two Dutch artists, Simon Postuma and Melanie Coe. In 1966, they were living in Ibiza, Spain, where they designed clothes and were prominent faces in the area's little hippie community. One day, a photographer, Carl Ferris, stumbled upon the two of them and immediately recognized their talent. Carl Ferris was already beginning to dabble in the psychedelic, and on meeting with these two, would dive all the way into the aesthetic. It was Carl who shot and designed all three of Jimi Hendrix's studio album covers. Carl promptly shipped this Dutch duo into London, where they all three opened a studio together. Not long after they would meet Barry Finch, a maverick public relations man in the music scene, who would link the collective up with Brian Epstein, securing their first official designer deal. Their work was everywhere. When the Beatles opened up their Apple boutique later in the year, it was The Fool who painted the incredible building facade. They also designed the costumes for the Beatles' All You Need Is Love worldwide television broadcast and the I Am the Walrus segment of Magical Mystery Tour. And when the Beatles were in the initial stages of planning the Sgt. Pepper album cover, The Fool were right at the top of the list as a potential candidate for designing it, and they were commissioned to produce sketches for the cover today, on the 10th. What they ended up producing was an admittedly striking and groovy piece of art, one which George especially loved, but Paul did not consider good enough. So Paul turned to the advice of gallerist Robert Fraser, who would end up becoming the unofficial art director for the album. And it was at his behest that Paul had over for supper today two individuals, Peter Blake and his wife Jan Haworth, both who were premier figures in the pop art scene. Paul approached the two with just the faintest of ideas. Look, we're on a little hill like this, and we have a floral clock there. What can we do with this? You can mess it round. I'm not fixed. I'd love your input. And from there, it grew. According to Peter Blake, a certain amount had already been established. The concept of there being a band within a band, for instance.
My main contribution, I think, was to decide that if we made the crowd in a certain way, it could be anybody. So I think that was that was the thing I would claim that really changed the direction of it.
After supper, it was studio time. Ever wonder what the bizarre, kazoo-like noises are in Lovely Rita? How do you think they accomplished that effect? I'll give you 3 seconds to guess. Fantastic! You are correct. It was indeed toilet paper wrapped around combs. How did you know? Emmerich recalls, on that same very silly night, they overdubbed the heavy breathing at the end of the song, with John looning about and sending the others, and Richard and me up in the control room, into fits of laughter. The Beatles were also visited by a host of musicians today, those being Tony Hicks of the Hollies, David Crosby of the Byrds, and Sean Phillips, who claims he got to record some backing vocals for the track. Later in the day, David Crosby was given the privilege of listening to a song few others had heard. I was, as near as I know, the first human being besides them and George Martin and the engineers to hear A Day in the Life. I was high as a kite, so high I was hunting geese with a rake. They sat me down. They had huge speakers, like coffins with wheels, that they rolled up on either side of the stool. By the time it got to the end of that piano chord, man, my brains were on the floor. Time to record a new song, Getting Better. Paul and John were always writing together to some degree, though this song was more co-written than most at the time. It's an optimistic song. I often try and get on to optimistic subjects in an effort to cheer myself up, and also realizing that other people are going to hear this, to cheer them up too. But the song is most well known for John's portion of the track, a brutal and revealing admission of guilt that drops out from Paul's sunniness like a ton of bricks.
I used to be cruel to my woman, I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved.
I used to be cruel to...
I've talked briefly about the discourse surrounding John as a partner and as a human being in general, and I plan to talk about it much more one day, so now is not the time. But from a musical context, to me, the brief verse serves as a perfect counterweight to the rest of the song, which without it would feel far shallower. That phrase specifically, getting better, was inspired by good old Jimmy Nichols, the man who filled in for Ringo while he had his tonsils removed. He had a penchant, when asked how he was doing, for saying, getting better. Despite being booked at 7 p.m., no Beatles showed until Ringo at 11 p.m., and recording wouldn't get underway until 1 a.m. This was an extreme example of behavior that was becoming frustratingly frequent for the boys' engineering team. To make matters worse, the Beatles' staple engineers, Emmerich and Lush, had the day off. So they worked with Malcolm Addy, who did not have much of a working relationship with the boys, and apparently, things did not go too smoothly. They recorded 7 takes of backing, the only interesting bit being that Paul played a pianette for the recording. Today, Jeff Emmerich returned to the studio after his day off. "Glad to have you back, Jeff," George Harrison said as soon as he walked in the door. Malcolm had clearly gotten on his nerves. When we played back the tapes of the previous evening's work in the control room, Ringo chimed in. "The drums sound a bit naff, don't you think?" George Harrison didn't even wait for an answer. Little wonder, considering that Malcolm didn't shut up long enough to get a decent drum sound. It was to be a day devoted to overdubs for Getting Better. Paul recorded his bass line. Ringo double-tracked some drum segments. And and George once more overdubbed some tambura, which accentuates the shift in energy as the song drops into John's short verse. I really, really love it. It was time to overdub the brass for John's Good Morning, Good Morning. And brought in today were three musicians familiar to the Beatles, members of the Sounds Incorporated, who were also managed by Brian Epstein, and had opened for the Beatles during their 1965 tour. So the group sat down and caught up with each other, before the Beatles requested that the engineering team play the musicians the songs they were currently working on. Emmerich recalls, "I was studying the expressions of the Sound Incorporated guys, trying to measure their reactions to the tracks we were playing for them. They were mesmerized. We knew that what we had been doing was exceptional, but it was gratifying to see that kind of response from people fresh to the project. From that point on, every time anyone came to visit the Beatles on a session, Richard and I hoped that we would be asked to play back something that was completed or in progress, not just because we loved hearing the tracks, but because we enjoyed seeing the stunned looks on their faces. I've said this before, but it warms my heart to hear how much pride the engineers had in the work they helped to create. Despite the pains that came with working with a group of egos like the Beatles, not once did anyone take the music for granted. It was special. It was then time to record. These brass players, frankly, were not on the same caliber of the world-class musicians that were usually brought in for these recordings, and were only selected because John himself asked it, as he didn't want the brass to sound too, quote-unquote, straight. They had a difficult time with it. First off, they were having trouble with the rhythm of the arrangement, and when they did finally get it right, John kept repeatedly saying that it was too straight, and he wanted it weirder. Eventually, though, they had to settle for what they got, and weirding it up was left to the engineers, with Richard Lush saying, "We ended up flanging, limiting and compressing it, anything to make it sound unlike brass playing." It was typical John Lennon. He just wanted it to sound weird. George Harrison's contribution of Only a Northern Song weeks earlier had impressed nobody, and was so lacking, in fact, that George Martin pretty much told him he had to write something better to get on the album. And his response was this: Within You and Without You. He recalled, Within You, Without You came about after I had spent a bit of time in India and fallen under the spell of the country and its music. It was written at Klaus Vormann's house in Hampstead after dinner one night. The song was to be completely different from anything the Beatles had done to that point. And while yes, it is a Beatles song, no other Beatle but George played or even sung a note. While it may not sound anything near a traditional Eastern composition, to a listener from that region, as far as Western pop was concerned, never before had a song been so steeped in the sounds and style of Indian music. So simply put, it required Indian musicians. When George first came in with the song, he played it to everyone on his guitar, and while they preferred it to Only a Northern Song, again, no one was too impressed. But only George understood just what he had in mind. On the day of recording, George was excited but relaxed. He asked that carpets be brought into the studio and laid down to make the space feel more homey and help the Indian musicians feel comfortable. On their arrival, he was incredibly gracious and kind. It was clear that he respected them greatly. Work began. All the Beatles were present. Paul milled about for a while, somewhat curious, but John seemed skeptical and impatient. Once recording started, Paul and John sat off in the distance with the artist Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, still in the process of planning the cover art for the album. George was now to occupy a role that he had never been able to with John and Paul around, the leader. Despite not being fully versed in all of the intricacies of the instruments the musicians played, he was still able to communicate his ideas. George Martin recalls, George loved working with these musicians, and it was fascinating to see how his ideas grew and how easily he communicated the complex music to them. Indian rhythms can be extraordinarily difficult, and I have a fond memory of George speaking in a strange tongue, emphasizing the accents with a wag of his head. The Indian musicians cottoned on instantly. It was most impressive. We'll now hear from musician Buddhadev Kansara. My experience with the Beatles was excellent. They were nothing but nice people. Only George Harrison spoke to me, as he was the one who was passionate about Indian music. He asked me if I could play the tambura, and then we took about 5 to 6 minutes to come up with the tune. I was very surprised when I got the call, as I always wanted to meet the Beatles, as they were very popular. I only heard the music briefly and I didn't really think much of it, as it wasn't completed when I was working on it. It was only 3 to 4 years later when I finally heard the song in my shop and recognized it, that I thought, this is excellent. Just as was the case for all the session musicians the Beatles utilized throughout the years. They were paid, but were not credited. It didn't matter to me if people knew I was on that song. For me, it was about the experience of working with the Beatles. All these years later that I have received recognition, I am most happy that people still care for Indian music. The song was the longest the Beatles had recorded yet, and by a good margin. I'll take a moment to speak here personally. I think this is a fantastic song. Yes, it is slow and somewhat dreary, but the sonic landscape it creates is layered and immersive. Despite being so different from any other song on Pepper, it fits in perfectly. The overdubs of tambura throughout the earlier tracks serve as little breadcrumbs before the whole loaf presented here. One of my critiques in many of George's songs are the somewhat preachy nature of the lyrics. This is still present here, but somehow feels far more genuine. Remember the Daily News article about the runaway teenager I brought up earlier? It was, of course, this article that inspired Paul to write the song the Beatles began work on today, She's Leaving Home. Paul would later say, I set out to imagine what might have happened, the sequence of events. In addition to the newspaper report, I'm pretty sure another influence was the Wednesday play. It was a weekly television play that often addressed big social issues. It's the kind of thing people would be discussing at the bus stop on Thursday morning. When we recorded She's Leaving Home, it was almost like a shooting script for the Wednesday play. Clutching her handkerchief, quietly turning the back door key. And the story of the real runaway, Melanie Coe, is far too interesting not to share. Melanie Coe had actually met the band more than 3 years before She's Leaving Home was even written. During their appearance on the English television program Ready, Steady, Go on October 4th, 1963.
You're keen on budding Brenda Lees, are you?
Oh, yes.
I'll bet you are, yes. Right. Well, let's introduce the 4 contestants to you. They are, from left to right, Judy Johnson. Hello, Judy. June Dartnell. Hi, June. Hello, Kathleen Sullivan. Hi there. And hello to Melanie Coe. Right, they're all set to go, I hope, are you? Ready, Paul? Okay, off we go with Let's Jump the Broomstick.
Melanie had entered the on-air lip-syncing contest, which Paul was judging, and got to briefly chat with some of the Beatles beforehand. She would recall, at this point they were big, but they weren't the huge success they were about to become. Ringo was just adorable. He had all these rings on and he let us try them on. He was a lovely guy. So was George. He stood and chatted with us and asked us about our schools and what we were thinking of studying. They were both very sweet. Paul said hello and that was it. And I remember John was busy talking to some of the studio producers and didn't really acknowledge that we were there. Melanie would end up winning the contest.
A terrific performance from 4 would-be Brenda Lees. Well, I wonder if our panel of judges has made up its mind and is unanimous.
Oh, yes, it has.
It is. It has.
Yes.
Yes. Paul, who's it going to be?
I think the winner, as far as I'm concerned, number 4.
Number 4, Melanie Coe. Here's the prize, Melanie, the LP from Paul, and all our congratulations. Very well done. Thank you. you.
I was very disappointed because there had been 2 shows before mine, and on both of those shows, the girl that won went out on a date with the pop star. I thought I was going to have a dinner date with the Beatles, so I was terribly disappointed with my prize. She was, however, awarded a year-long stint as a background dancer on the show, a position that drew no admiration from her parents, who wanted her to pursue dentistry. And a few years later, she would once again have a Beatles encounter. I was with a friend at the Bag o' Nails Club when I was 17, just before I ran away from home. She was from Hamburg, and she said she knew the Beatles very well, but I didn't believe her. We were sitting down having a drink, and in walks John Lennon with his entourage, and she waves to him and he comes over to us. "It's you, come join us." That's how it was. It would be years later that Melanie discovered that the song was written about her, and something that struck her was just how true to life the lyrics were. The most interesting thing in the song is what the father said. We gave her everything money could buy. And in the newspaper article, my father actually says almost those words. He doesn't understand why I would have left home when they bought me or gave me everything. Which is true.
Her boyfriend wasn't then a man from the motor trade, but amazingly, Paul's lyric was almost right.
Well, he was a croupier, but previously, funnily enough, he'd actually worked in the car business. So he was a man from the motor trade, which is the lyric from the song.
It's almost telepathic.
By the time work actually began, Paul had been itching terribly to record the song, and unfortunately, as a result of his impatience, the arrangement was not scored by George Martin, but by Mike Leander. Let's hear from George Martin. During the making of Pepper, Paul was also to give me one of the biggest hurts of my life. At the time, I was still having to record all my other artists. One day, Paul rang me to say, "I've got a song I want you to work with me on. Can you come round tomorrow afternoon? I want to get it done quickly. We'll book an orchestra, and you can score it." "I can't tomorrow, Paul. I'm recording Scylla at 2:30. "Come on, you can come round at 2 o'clock. "No, I can't. I've got a session on." "All right then," he said, and that ended the conversation. What he did then, as I discovered later, was to get Neil Aspinall, the road manager, to ring round and find someone else to do the score for him, simply because I couldn't do it at that short notice. In the end, he found Mike Leander, who could. The following day, Paul presented me with it and said, "Here we are. I've got a score. We can record it now." I recorded it, with a few alterations to make it work better, but I was hurt. I thought, "Paul, you could have waited." Paul obviously didn't think it was important that I should do everything. To me, it was. I wasn't getting much out of it from a financial point of view, but at least I was getting satisfaction. The score itself was good enough, and still holds up today, but it was the only score that was ever done by anyone else during all my time with the Beatles. It appears that Paul was the lone Beatle at the studio today, and as you could imagine, the atmosphere was tense between him and Martin. Paul would sit up in the control room while Martin conducted. Included in the group of musicians was harpist Sheila Bromberg, the first woman ever to record with the group, and the following recollection is shared by her.
And I was sitting here at 8:30, tuning the harp. A piece of music was plonked on my music stand. I gave it a brief look. Oh yeah, right. I recognised the Liverpool accent, turned round, of course it was Paul McCartney. Well, first of all, I played exactly what was written, which is, I'm reading the music here. Then I stopped and he said, "No, I don't want that, I want something." So I thought, how can I make it different? I think he had an idea in his head of what he wanted it to sound like, but he couldn't describe it, he couldn't express it. During the session, after each time we played it, Paul McCartney, we'd hear the controls from the controls. "No, I don't want that, I want something..." So we play it again. Came midnight, and the string section were really fed up. And eventually the leader of the string orchestra stood up, Eric Grunberg, tucked his violin under his arm and said, "Now it is midnight, we have to go home because we are working in the morning." So a voice from the control box said, "Well, I suppose that's that then." We all went home.
Despite Paul's pressing, they ended up using the very first recorded take for the song.
We gave her
was now time to tackle the lead and backing vocals for the song, which required a fair amount of finesse. I think that the following recollection from Emmerich is very striking. The lights in the studio were turned off to set the mood. The sole source of illumination was a table lamp next to the wall. The two Beatles, lifelong friends and collaborators, sat on high stools, facing each other, studying each other's lips intently for phrasing. Watching them, I remember thinking that John and Paul's voices were so different, yet so perfectly complemented each other's, just like their personalities and approach to music making. It wasn't an easy vocal to nail down either. At one point there was a long discussion about getting the right amount of emotion into the lyric. Paul was quite the perfectionist by this time, and he was really pissing John off by having him sing the same line over and over again.
We gave her everything money could buy. She's leaving home after...
Tuesday, March 21st is a day that lives in infamy for one reason alone. It was the day that John inadvertently took LSD while in the recording studio. Despite frequent mentions of the boys being, quote, off their heads during recording sessions by the engineers, this was always due to some combination of weed, pep pills, aka amphetamines, and maybe the odd bump of cocaine now and then. But working under the influence of LSD was something that the Beatles had no desire to even attempt. In fact, the whole reason as to how John took acid was due to reaching into his little pep pill box for a little pick-me-up and inadvertently ingesting LSD instead. But first, before the chaos began, the Beatles got to work overdubbing the lead and backing vocals for Getting Better. They recorded several attempts, but not long into, John began to feel unwell. George Martin recalls, I was standing next to John, discussing some finer point of the arrangement to Getting Better, when he suddenly looked up at me. George, he said slowly, I'm not feeling too good. I'm not focusing on me. This was a pretty odd thing to say, even for John. I studied him. I'd been oblivious to it until then. But he did look pretty awful. Not sick, but twitchy and strange. Do you want someone to take you home? I asked. No, he replied. I don't want to go home. Come on, John, I said. What you need is a breath of fresh air. I know the way up onto the roof. When we had clambered out onto the flat roof of studio number 2, we found it was a beautiful clear night. John took a deep breath and, with a bit of a lurch, took a couple steps toward the edge of the building. I grabbed hold of his arm. It was a good 50 feet to the ground. We stood there for a minute or two, with John swaying gently against my arm. I'm feeling better, he announced. Then he looked up at the stars. Wow, he intoned. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? I followed his gaze. The stars did look good, but they didn't look that good. It was very unlike John to be over the top in that way. I stared at him. He was wired, pin-sharpened, quivering, resonating away like a human tuning fork. No sooner had John uttered his immortal words about the stars than George and Paul came bursting out onto the roof. They knew why John was feeling unwell. Maybe everyone else did, too. Everyone except for father figure George Martin here. It was very simple. John was tripping on LSD. The fact was that John was only too likely to imagine he could fly and launch himself off the low parapet that ran around the roof. They had been absolutely terrified that he might do so.
I never took it in the studio. Once I did accidentally. I thought it was taking some uppers, and I was not in a state of handling it, you know. And I can't remember what album it was, but I took it and then so scared on the mic, you know. I said, "What was it?" You know, I said, "I feel ill." I thought I felt ill, and it was I thought it was going cracked, you know. And then I said, "I must get some air," and they all took me upstairs on the roof, and George Martin was looking at me funny, you know. And then it dawned on me, I must have taken acid. And I said, well, I can't go on, I have to go. So I just said, you'll have to do it, and I'll just stay and watch. And I was just, you know, like very nervous and just watching them all. I said, is it all right? And they were saying, yeah, you know, all being very kind. And I said, yes, it's all right. And I said, are you sure it's all right? And I said, And they carried on making a record.
The day, however, was just beginning. Paul's lovely Rita still had a missing chunk in the middle. They had earlier attempted to record a Harrison guitar solo, but after a couple of hours, they realized it wasn't quite working. So Jeff Emmerich suggested they stick a piano solo there, to which Paul casually replied, "Sure, well why don't you play it?" This is a moment that Emmerich would come to regret. Due to a bout of musical shyness, he told Paul that he couldn't do it. So Paul gave it a stab, but wasn't happy with his attempts. Well, who better to step up at this moment than good old George Martin, who had contributed so many piano solos in his days with the Beatles. As he had already done several times before, most famously in My Life, George Martin played the solo at a slower speed before artificially speeding up the recording. But that was just one component of the sound. It was time for the engineers to get creative again, here utilizing some very unorthodox techniques. But first, a quick beat. As far as George Martin and the engineers' work is concerned, Sgt. Pepper is undoubtedly the most documented album. I have poured hours into reading recollections from both Martin and Emmerich, and one thing I've picked up on is how both of them will claim sole credit to some idea or process. They will both describe the same actions near verbatim, but almost always, they will say, "I did this," rather than "we did this." Is this simply a matter of flawed recollection, or is it a quirk of the ego? Who really knows? But regardless, it is a definite trend, and is once again the case here. I'll share Emmerich's recollection. Just know that Martin said the exact same thing. But in the true Pepper spirit of experimentation, Paul asked me to screw things up so the solo didn't sound like it was coming from a piano. This time around, I decided to place some sticky editing tape on the guide rollers of a tape machine that was sending signal to the echo chamber, causing the tape to wow and flutter. The end result was an audible and quite interesting wobble in the piano sound. As the Beatles were about to leave, Norman Smith walked into the studio. Now, Norman had worked as an engineer with the Beatles from their inception all the way up to Rubber Soul when he was promoted to work as a producer. Not even 2 years later, he began producing for an up-and-coming act named The Pink Floyd. And it was with the members of Pink Floyd that he turned up, uninvited, might I add. Now the Beatles, reaching the end of their workday, and very much aware that John was tucked away somewhere tripping on acid, did not at all greet the group warmly, and clearly were uninterested in any sort of social niceties at this time. After a few minutes of obligatory awkward chatting, Norman and the Pink Floyd got the message, and promptly left the studio. As they left, John joined Paul and Mal Evans, the latter who drove them to Paul's home. On the way there, Paul decided that he would join John and take some LSD as well. This was only Paul's second trip and was to be his very first with John. His recollection here feels immensely important, so I am going to share it in almost its entirety. I thought, maybe this is the moment where I should take a trip with him. It's been coming for a long time. John's on it already, so I'll sort of catch up. It was my first trip with John, or with any of the guys. Me and John, we'd known each other for a long time. Along with George and Ringo, we were best mates, and we looked into each other's eyes. The eye contact thing we used to do, which is fairly mind-boggling. You dissolve into each other. But that's what we did, round about that time. That's what we did a lot, and it was amazing. You're looking into each other's eyes, and you would want to look away, but you wouldn't, and you could see yourself in the other person. It was a very freaky experience, and I was totally blown away. There's something disturbing about it. You ask yourself, how do you come back from it? How do you then lead a normal life after that? And the answer is, you don't. After that, you've got to get trepanned, or you've got to meditate for the rest of your life. You've got to make a decision which way you're gonna go. I would walk into the garden. Oh no, I've got to go back in. It was very tiring. Walking made me very tired, but I've got to do it for my well-being. In the meantime, John had been sitting around very enigmatically, and I had a big vision of him as a king, the absolute emperor of eternity. It was a good trip, but I wanted to go to bed after a while. I'd just had enough after about 4 or 5 hours. John said, Go to bed? You won't sleep. I know that. I've still got to go to bed. But of course, you don't just sleep off an acid trip. So I went to bed and hallucinated a lot in bed. I remember Mal coming up and checking that I was all right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I could feel every inch of the house, and John seemed like some sort of emperor in control of it all. It was quite strange. On the 23rd, the boys finished the vocal overdubs for Getting Better, after their work had been brought to a screeching halt by John's accidental LSD trip.
I used to get mad at my school. Now I can't complain. The teachers that taught me weren't cool. Now I can't complain. You're holding me down, turning me round, filling me up with your rules. I've got to admit.
The Beatles would take a short break and then return on March 28th to continue overdubbing. And 2 John songs were the focus today. Good Morning, and Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Paul would play the lead guitar on Good Morning. Which, according to Emmerich, didn't do anything to improve George Harrison's mood. I can't imagine that it did. If we've learned anything from the Sgt. Pepper's sessions, it is how much fun John had with the textural work in his songs, to conceptualizing the orchestral overdub on A Day in the Life, to wanting to smell the sawdust and hear swirly music in Mr. Kite. John always brought to the table his unique, unorthodox ideas. And this would continue today. Here's George Martin. To follow the sound of the Kellogg's cockerel at the end of Good Morning, John had the idea of putting animal noises on it, and of putting these sounds in sequence. The idea was that we always had an animal that could swallow up the animal that came immediately before it. John had actually thought this through to the extent that he'd written down a list of the animals he wanted on there, in order. The sounds were of course pulled from the EMI archive. Now it was time to return to Mr. Kite. As we covered in the last video, George Martin and Geoff Emerick painstakingly put together the atmospheric, swirly circus music that John desired by digging through the sound archive, cutting up bits of tape, and then stitching it back together to create something that sounded musical, but completely out of control. With that textural work in place, it was time to reel in the madness by overdubbing some quote-unquote real music to slide on top of it. John and George Martin both played some organ, Paul added some electric guitar, Ringo some tambourine, and even Mal Evans joined in on the fun by playing his enormous bass harmonica. I could not imagine an instrument more befitting for him. All of this was recorded at half speed, so that when played back at normal speed, the instruments sounded frantic and surreal. How often have you heard me say this? The final song written for Sgt. Pepper is the endearing and sincere, with a little help from my friends. Undoubtedly my favorite Ringo-led track. And it is also one of the more collaborative Lennon-McCartney songs written in the band's later years. From the jump, they knew this was one to be given to Ringo. Poking a little fun at Ringo was actually a lot of fun. What would you do if I sang out of tune? Actually, John and I wrote this song within a vocal range that would cause no problems for Ringo, and I think that's one reason why it was such a great success for him. The song was performed very much in the style of the Sgt. Pepper album as a whole, the style of a live show, in which the song is sung by a certain Billy Shears. For those old enough to remember, Billy Shears was the name of the person who supposedly replaced me in the Beatles when I'd died after a road accident in 1966. That was a crazy rumor that had been doing the rounds. Now Billy Shears showed up, large as life, in the guise of Ringo Starr. This song contains one of my favorite lines in a Beatles song, one that could be interpreted any number of ways, but I have always thought was especially poignant. That is,
What do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine.
which according to Paul, may have just been some veiled crude humor. It could have been him playing with his willy under the covers, or it could have been taken on a deeper level. This was what it meant, but it was a nice way to say it, a very non-specific way to say it. I love it nonetheless. Recording began. Just as he had done for A Day in the Life, Emmerich loosened the skins on Ringo's toms to give them that deep, resonant boom. They recorded 10 takes of backing, with Ringo on drums, Paul on piano, George on electric guitar, and John on cowbell. The session went late into the night and into the next morning. Emmerich recalls, Richard and I watched an exhausted Ringo begin to trudge up the stairs. That was our signal, as usual, that the session was over, and we began to relax. He was at the halfway point when we heard Paul's voice call out, "Where are you going, Ring?" he said. Ringo looked surprised. "Home. To bed." "Nah, let's do the vocal now." Ringo looked to the others for support. "But I'm knackered," he protested. To his dismay, both John and George were taking Paul's side. "No, come back here and do some singing for us," John said with a grin. Fortunately for us all, Ringo got his lead vocal done relatively quickly. Perhaps the shock tactic of having him sing when he was at least expecting it took the nervousness away. Or perhaps it was just how supportive everyone was being. All three of his compatriots gathered around him, inches behind the microphone, silently conducting and cheering him on as he gamely tackled his vocal duties. It was a touching show of unity among the four Beatles. The only problem was the song's last high note, which Ringo had a bit of trouble hitting spot on. For a while he lobbied to have the tape slowed down just for that one drop-in, and we tried it, but even though it allowed him to sing on pitch, it didn't match tonally to the rest of the vocal. He sounded a bit silly, almost like one of the goons. "No, Ring, you've got to do it properly," Paul finally concluded. It took a few tries, but Ringo finally hit the note, and held it, without too much wavering. Amid the cheers of his bandmates and a Scotch and Coke toast, the session finally ended.
From my friend.
The big day had arrived. It was time to shoot the iconic Sgt. Pepper album cover. It had taken weeks to prepare the photography studio. On first glance, it may be easy to mistake the cover as a collage, a scrapbook-style imposition of different cutouts, laid flat and stitched together. This is not the case. The Beatles, and everything around and behind them, were tangible and real. The lineup of famous figures in the background were picked by Robert Fraser, Jan Haworth, Peter Blake, and obviously, the Beatles, though mostly by John and Paul. George picked out 3 Indian gurus for his selection, and as far as I can tell, the only person Ringo suggested that made the cover was Issy Bon. Famously, John wanted 3 controversial figures on the album cover, the first being Adolf Hitler. Jan Haworth recalled, "John wanted Adolf Hitler, which I thought was a very ugly choice, beyond provocative. I have no idea what his thinking was," which I have to agree with. Along with that, he also wanted Jesus and Gandhi. Jesus' name was thrown out pretty quickly, though Gandhi very nearly made the cover.
Anyway, he came round to my house. He said, "I'm afraid, old chap," he said, "we can't have Gandhi." I said, "What do you mean? Gandhi? He's all right. You know, what's wrong with him?" "Well, I'd offend the Indians."
They were very important. We shouldn't upset India. And in his particular case, I refused to have anything to do with it immediately.
Of all the faces the Beatles themselves chose, there were no women. Not trying to stir anything up here, just thought it was worth noting. The pictures of these individuals were mostly sourced from photo libraries, such as the BBC Radio Times Holton Picture Library, though some were obtained from personal sources, such as Stuart Sutcliffe's, which his family mailed over. The photos were enlarged to life size in the lab, and then printed out and mounted onto hardboard. Almost all of these photos were originally in black and white, and so had to be meticulously tinted, a task that was primarily performed by assistant Nigel Hartnett and Jan. The Sgt. Pepper drumhead was contributed by fairground painter Joe Fgrave, who had worked with Jan previously. The set itself was constructed in the studio of the photographer who would capture the album cover, Michael Cooper. The wax figures, borrowed from the one and only Madame Tussauds, were a last-minute addition. The Beatles arrived at the studio. The shoot was to take about 3 hours in total, and was a delicate balancing act of visual depth, lighting, and arrangement. Let's share a bit of recollection from photography assistant Nigel to paint the scene that day. Soul music was throbbing constantly in the studio, headed by Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Booker T. Few people stood still. Everybody was moving some part of their body with the beat. The joint was jumping, as they say. It was a strange time. With so many full-size figures around, I would find myself dodging dummies, as if they were real people, and then bumping into someone because I thought they were a cutout, and was surprised when they moved. So many people were smoking that the atmosphere was thickening and threatening the air quality. I have to say that it was not just tobacco, but lots of weed was being passed around. The three of us didn't partake until it was all finished, as we had serious work to do. In the photograph, the Beatles stare intently into the camera, a decision that Paul McCartney recalls was influenced by, I had seen a thing on TV about eye contact in apes, so with Michael Cooper's inside photo, we all said, now, look into the camera and really say, I love you. If you look at it, you'll see the big effort in the eyes. When the shoot finally finished, most of the incredible set ended up junked, which, even without the benefit of retrospect, seems somewhat baffling. One of the artifacts that did survive, that being the painted drumhead, would go for over $1 million at auction in 2008. While history has assigned Peter Blake the bulk of the credit for the cover's design, so many artists contributed.
Things happened like there was a young boy who was helping who said, oh, could I do a guitar in hyacinths? And it was such a nice sort of gentle, sweet idea that we said, yes, certainly. So this sort of white shape at the front is actually a guitar. One of the myths that rose was that you can read that as P-A-U-L ? When the stories of Paul's death were rife, this was a sign that Paul had indeed died. But of course it was never intended to be P-A-U-L ? It's simply a guitar.
Bye.
The album was nearly complete. In just 2 days, Paul would be flying off to America to visit Jane Asher, who was currently touring in a theater performance of Romeo and Juliet. To tie the album's whole concept neatly together, the idea of a reprisal was floated, not by any of the Beatles or engineers, but by Neil Aspinall. You're giving a concert, why don't you wrap up the concert with another version of Sgt. Pepper? Due to the last-minute nature of the idea, the Beatles recorded not in their usual Studio 2, but in Studio 1, a space that was far more reverberant, and contributed to the slightly more live and bright sound of the reprisal. This effect, though, would have been distractingly present, if not for the efforts of Emmerich and Lush. First, I had Richard and the maintenance engineer on duty gather up all the available tall screens and build a kind of hut, thus creating a smaller room within a room. Then I asked Mal and Neil to set up the drums and amplifiers very near one another, so that there would be minimal delay on the signal that would inevitably spill between the mics. It was an 11-hour session and the studio atmosphere was electric. The Beatles had fun recording a faster, livelier version of a song they already knew front to back. Emmerich recalls, everybody was really upbeat that day, and it shows. It was a great rhythm track, and I could feel the excitement building from the very first moment, even in Paul's count-in, which had a tremendous energy of its own. Ringo was pounding the hell out of his drums. He was even stomping on the bass drum pedal harder than usual. In fact, everyone was playing full out. Considering that they'd all been cloistered in the studio for so long, pouring their hearts and souls into the album, it really was incredible how good and tight their playing was. The recording was complete. With that, the Beatles had created a masterpiece. But beyond the music, we still have some loose ends to tie up. So, you've already spent an enormous amount of money and time designing and shooting the most ambitious album cover ever conceived. A cover containing the faces of over 50 famous individuals. Surely you went through the trouble of attaining permissions from these people before you went through the hubbub of everything else. Of course not. In fact, with Brian Epstein suffering immensely from his drug use at this period, no one had even considered this technical difficulty until EMI themselves brought it up.
They'd been refused permission by the EMI music department to issue this cover because there were massive, important people on it. And Paul McCartney said, "There's no risk whatsoever. Everybody on here will be delighted." I said, "Well, that's what you think, and I hope you're right."
They requested that every single person present on the cover provide permission for their inclusion, and had the Beatles publisher, NME, set aside $20 million in case of lawsuits. The person set to lead this overwhelming task was Brian Epstein's assistant, Wendy Hansen. Well, former assistant actually, as she had resigned not long before all this madness due to the difficulty of working with Brian in the throes of his drug addiction. So she was hired on a freelance basis, as Brian had nowhere else to turn. Brian asked me to try and get legal clearances from everybody within a week. EMI wasn't keen on the cover, but Paul wanted to do it. It was an incredible job. I spent many hours and pounds on calls to the States. Some people agreed to it, but others wouldn't. Fred Astaire was very sweet, and Shirley Temple wanted to hear the record first. I got on famously with Marlon Brando, but Mae West wanted to know what she would be doing in a Lonely Hearts Club.
Mae West wrote back and said, "What would I be doing in the Lonely Hearts Club? No, I won't be on it." So then I think it was suggested that the Beatles all wrote her a personal letter and said, "We'd very much like you to be on it." Then she said yes, she would.
Thankfully, due to the Beatles' high regard, they received permission from almost every single person on the sleeve, with not a penny paid to any of them, which nowadays would never occur. The one individual who did want money was Leo Gorcey of the Bowery Boys, who requested $500. According to Paul, he was on the back now, so they just put a bit of blue sky where he had been.
Nothing happened from that day to this. As far as I know, not a single complaint came from anybody. Nobody asked to be left off the record.
We still have another novelty to cover, that being the back cover. The Beatles decided that they wanted the lyrics to all the songs printed in full on the back, which would be the first time this had ever been done for a rock LP. They once more had to negotiate an agreement with EMI, who were worried that the inclusion of the lyrics would hurt the sales of the sheet music to be later distributed. All in all, the conception, execution, and then negotiations surrounding the album cover had been more elaborate and time-consuming than any cover art ever created. Paul would say, "We fought like devils, I tell you, but I see no reason why you shouldn't fight for things like that. It was like, we're the Beatles. It's not as if we're some shitty act. We're making you a lot of money. It's not as if you couldn't give us a little bit back. All we're trying to do is give people a great deal. They'll buy more because it's a great deal, and they'll come back for the next one." So it all seemed very wise to us. On April 3rd, Paul would fly with Mal Evans to San Francisco. And if you would like to continue the Beatles story from there, you can do so in part 1 of the Making of Magical Mystery Tour. This has been a tremendous undertaking, and by far my most detailed recounting of any period in the Beatles' history. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. And if you want to watch videos early and help me to continue to make these videos, also consider supporting me on Patreon. You can do so for only $1 a month, and it helps a lot. Thank you so much for watching.